Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm Jordan and welcome to my November wrap up. November was a little bit of a slower reading month for me, which honestly is a good thing. Basically since July, I've been reading like 20 or more books a month. And while I love that too, I know it's not always sustainable for me and my lifestyle and my family and traveling and vacations and all that stuff. It's good to just keep in mind that I can read fewer books some months and still keep up with my content and still keep up with new releases and all of that. I feel like I know it, but it's good to have a reminder month every once in a while. So in November, I finished 13 books, which is still a lot, but again, it's a lot less than I've been reading the past several months. I did not DNF any books. 10 of those 13 books were for videos and have been featured in reading vlogs, so I will have all of those linked below and I will talk about those videos as I'm going through the books. So if you want more thoughts on any of the books that I talk about that have been featured, you can go to those videos to hear more about them. And that means 3 of the books I just read for fun or not for videos. For genres this month, I had a pretty even split. I read 4 mystery, thriller, horror books. I kind of mash those all together because I find it hard to separate what book goes in which of those 3 genres. I think there's a lot of overlap. I read 4 contemporary or romance books, 3 historical fiction books, 1 sci-fi, and 1 nonfiction. As far as formats go, over half of these books I read as a combination between the audio and the physical, whether that means reading them at the same time or sometimes I would listen to the audio and then when I had a second to sit down and read the physical, I would switch to physical. I really enjoy doing that whenever I have an audiobook available for a book that I own physically as well. 4 books I read completely physical, no audio, and 2 books I only listened to the audio because I do not have a physical version. And for my ratings this month, it was a pretty good reading month ratings wise. I had 0 1-stars, 2 2-star books, 6 3-star books, 4 4-stars, and 1 5-star. I'm always happy to have at least 1 5-star book every month, especially when it's a slower reading month. It's okay if I don't have a ton of 5 stars, but a good sign when I have at least 1. And now let's go ahead and talk about the books that I read. I'm gonna start with all of the books that I featured in vlogs. I'll keep my descriptions and reviews somewhat short for those, and then at the end I will talk about the books that I have not talked about yet anywhere else. So the first video that I put out in November was my Book of the Month reading vlog. This is a recurring series on my channel where I read the new Book of the Month books as I get them. This one was actually quite successful. The first book that I read for it is The Family Game by Catherine Steadman. This is a new release thriller about this woman who is marrying into a very wealthy and respected family. They have a lot of secrets and she gets caught up in this big, tangled, dramatic family game or series of games that this family likes to do around the holidays. This was the perfect book to read around this time of year. It starts early November and spans through Christmas. So that is when I would most highly recommend reading this book. So right now, if you have this on your radar and have not read it yet, I would highly recommend it. I thought it was a lot of fun. It's a little over the top, so definitely know that going in, but I ended up rating it 4 stars. Then in that video, I picked up As Long as the Lemon Trees Go by Zulfa Katu. This is a historical fiction book set in Syria, and we're following our main character who is in the middle of war times in her country. There's a revolution happening and she is a pharmacy student who has all of a sudden been thrust into being a surgeon and saving people's lives who are getting injured from the attacks and things like that. And she is really struggling with the decision of whether she should flee her country to save her life and save some of her family members, or if she should stay, do what she can to continue saving people's lives, support her community at the risk of her own life. Very hard-hitting. This is the type of book that I read 15 pages and knew right off the bat it was going to be 5 stars. Just the way it was written completely put you into the scenario, and it made me feel for this main character so much. I was rooting for her every step of the way. Absolutely loved it. 5 stars. Would highly recommend. And then the last book that I read for that Book of the Month video is Practical Magic by Alice Hoffman. I have seen this book everywhere. I've seen this movie everywhere. I have not watched the movie, but I know a lot of people love the movie. This is about 2 sisters who grow up being raised by, I think, 2 of their aunts, and their aunts are accused of being witches. So the whole town kind of ostracizes this family. These sisters grow up without many friends because no one wants to be friends with the town witches and risk like cursing themselves or whatever. We follow them through that childhood, and then as adults, one of the sisters moves out of the town to start a new life. She's doing really well when all of a sudden her other sister comes knocking on her door and brings some trouble with her. I get why so many people like this story. It just wasn't quite the story for me. I don't typically like stories that follow characters for like decades of their lives. nor do I really care for witchy, magical elements in books, so it just wasn't the right combination of things for me, but I respect it for what it is. I have heard people also say that the movie is even better than the book, so perhaps someday in the future I could see myself trying the movie instead, but I ended up giving this book 2 stars. The next reading vlog that I posted in November was my Slaughterfest reading vlog, which is a readathon that I co-hosted along with Beth from Best All Booked and Ashley from Ashley's Little Library. This was a really fun week-long readathon dedicated to reading spooky books. The first one that I read is Sundial by Katrina Ward. I had seen a lot about this book and this author. A lot of people in the horror community really like her. I was nervous going into this book because I didn't know if it was going to be like realistic horror or supernatural horror, or if it was going to be really confusing and hard for me to follow. I'm very happy to say that that was not at all the case. I ended up really enjoying this one. There was kind of a point like between halfway and 3/4 where I was like, I don't really know where this is going, but at the end of this book, everything completely clicks into place. I was really satisfied with the series of reveals. I thought it was a really well-crafted book, and I'm excited to read more from Katrina Ward, and I rated this one 4 stars. Then at this point in the readathon, I was feeling a little horrored out, so I shifted gears a little bit and started reading a contemporary. This is My Oxford Year by Julia Whalen. This is about a woman who is pursuing a master's degree, I think, and she gets a Rhodes Scholarship, which is a year-long scholarship to study at Oxford. She's from the US, but she moves to England for that year to study. While she's doing that, she's also pursuing a remote position back in the US to support a political candidate. So she's really busy juggling her school and her work. She's very career focused and driven when all of a sudden she meets someone at Oxford that she starts to develop feelings for, and it goes from there. This book definitely takes a turn in its tone like halfway through once it shifts to more of a romance and less of a focus on the main character's career objectives, and I wasn't a big fan of that shift. So this book ultimately ended up being just kind of meh for me, 3 stars, but it was a nice palate cleanser in between all of the thriller and horror books that I was reading at this point in the month. Then I jumped right back into the horror and read Cirque Berserk by Jessica Guess. This is a young adult slasher book. It follows a group of high schoolers who are celebrating like their senior night in high school. They're about to all graduate from high school. They want to do something fun, so they decide to go to this abandoned amusement park, which is rumored to be haunted, and it's said that anyone who goes into the amusement park never comes out. So they're like, yeah, of course, let's do it. And then it turns into a slasher, so most of them do not make it out. This was so much fun. I'm coming to find that I actually really enjoy slashers. Well, I've only read 2 and they've both really pleasantly surprised me. I've given them both 4 stars. So I'm thinking that maybe this is something I should try to read more of. In this book, I was just pleasantly surprised by, for how short it is and for how much killing there is, I was surprised by how much I connected with the characters and actually was interested in the plot going on. There was a little more than meets the eye when it comes to this story. So super fun time, would highly recommend it if slashers are your thing and you haven't gotten to this one yet. I gave it 4 stars. The last book that I read for that Slaughterfest video is Girl Forgotten by Karen Slaughter. This is the sequel to Karen Slaughter's super popular book called Pieces of Her. That one has been adapted into a TV show. I have read that first book. I would recommend reading that first book before jumping into the second one. This basically follows the same main character. She is becoming a US Marshal and she's on her first assignment. I ended up giving this book 3 stars because I think Karen Slaughter is very intelligent. She's very good at crafting mysteries and thrillers that are intriguing and that are kind of puzzle piecey in how they're revealed and how they come together. I love all of that. This just felt really low stakes to me, especially compared to the first book where our main character and her mom were in like imminent danger. This second book to me felt like they weren't, so I wasn't as invested in her solving the mystery and saving herself. It was more like, okay, you're doing your job as a US Marshal, so I would hope you could solve this case. But still, I see why Karen Slaughter is such a popular author because again, it was just very well crafted. So 3 stars if I didn't already say that. The next 3 books that I read in November were for kind of a secret reading blog that should already be up by the time this video is going up. It was a very gimmicky video where I polled my followers on Instagram for what book I should pick up next, but I decided to pick the least voted for option instead of the most. So basically reading all of the books that my followers didn't want me to read. And I had some karma come back at me for that one because my ratings of these books were not particularly high. not to completely spoil that video, but the first book that I read is In the Quick by Kate Hope Day. This is a science fiction book about this girl who has always been very scientifically minded. She had an uncle who was a scientist at this space program, and she has always kind of wanted to follow his footsteps. So we follow her as she is trying to do that. She goes to this space program and we follow her through that. I loved the premise of this book. I loved the main character. I loved like the first quarter of this book so much. And then I felt like it just lost steam. I didn't really know what the point of it was after a while. Like at the beginning, I thought there was a very clear purpose of the story, and then it just drifted away from that. So I was confused. I was confused at the pacing. It was slow, but then there would be time jumps. And then the ending left me very unsatisfied. So 3 stars because good premise, and I love space books, especially women in space books. Love all of that, just wanted so much more from the execution, so I was let down by it. Then I read Jackpot by Nick Stone. This is a young adult contemporary book about our main character who has a mom and a brother, and that's their family, and they are living beyond their means. So they're always struggling for money. They're kind of in this cycle where their mom wants to live in this good neighborhood and go to this good school so that she can provide a good education for her children, but it's in more of an affluent neighborhood that's costlier to live there. And so the main character, even though she's a teenager, ends up having to work a ton to help support their family. And because she has to work so much, that means she can't study and get the education that she is trying to get. But her mom doesn't want to move them out of that neighborhood and out of that situation. So there's a lot of conflict between the main character and her mother, and money is a central issue. And our main character works at a gas station where lottery tickets are sold. And one day it's revealed that the previous day their gas station sold a winning ticket. So then our main character is on kind of a mission to find the person who bought that ticket, and her kind of daydreaming about what that kind of lottery money would do for their family. And I really liked some of the conversations in here. I really liked reading the family struggle parts, even though they were very difficult to read, of course. It just felt very real and understandable, and like you can see both sides of the argument, and I appreciated that. I liked the lottery ticket subplot a lot less, so I ended up giving this book 3 stars as well. And the last book that I read for that video is The Henna Artist by Alka Joshi. This is a historical fiction book set in the 1950s in India. It's about this woman who is in an arranged marriage. She's not happy, so she runs away. She flees to this big city. She becomes a henna artist, and somewhat quickly becomes really successful and notorious for her great henna work, and she starts getting some really wealthy clients who confide in her as she's providing her services, and so she kind of becomes intertwined in like the wealthy elite of this big city in India. And then she finds out she has a sister, and her sister comes to live with her, so she's kind of trying to train her sister on how to do what she's doing. And on paper, I really feel like I should have loved this book. It has a lot of elements that I love in a lot of books, with historical fiction elements, with hard-hitting topics, but something in this one just did not connect with me. I felt like it was such a chore to read this book, which is never a great feeling and leaves me at the end being like, was it a me problem or was it a book problem? I'm not really sure. I'm giving it 2 stars just because of that enjoyment aspect. But this book does have a really high average rating on Goodreads, and a lot of people love it. It was a Reese Witherspoon book club pick, so I would still recommend it if the premise sounds interesting to you, or if you've had your eye on this book for a while. It is part of a series. I believe it's going to be a trilogy. The second book is already out. It's called The Secret Keeper of Jaipur, and I believe the 3rd book in the trilogy is coming out this coming spring. I want to recommend it. I just didn't really enjoy it that much, so I won't be continuing on in the series, but I am heartbroken about it because the cover of this book is beautiful. Again, the idea of it I like, but I just have to be honest with my enjoyment of the books that I read. And that brings us to the 3 books that I read this month that I have not yet talked about anywhere else. The first one is Distant Shores by Kristen Hanna. Kristen Hanna is an author that I have finally dove headfirst into this year. I read all of her most popular books and really enjoyed most of them, so I have been looking to dabble a little bit into her backlist because it is quite large. She's written a lot of books. This one I definitely chose first because of the cover. I think it's very beautiful, but this is about a middle-aged woman who is married. She has kids who are grown and out of the house, and she basically realizes she is no longer happy in her marriage, so she makes the decision to move away from her husband go back to this house that's on, I can't remember if it's a lake or the ocean, but it's by the water. She likes the environment. She wants to get back into painting. She's basically trying to find herself as an adult woman who has kind of been trapped a little bit in this marriage and family that she's been consumed by for so many years. This book, I think, is relatable in a lot of ways, especially for people who are married and have children potentially. We can all relate to the struggle of daily life when you are consumed with like your family's activities and doing things for everyone else and not having a second for yourself. And I thought this was a nice exploration of that. I just didn't really think it did anything super special or didn't say anything super profound that I haven't already read before or that made me think of anything any differently. There also is a cheating aspect in this book that I feel like wasn't addressed at all, and that felt very strange to me. So I ended up giving this one 3 stars. It's probably going to be very forgettable in my mind. I won't really be able to remember these specific characters a few months from now. And I can unfortunately see why people don't talk about this book as much as Chris and Hannah's more popular books. But I will still continue to give her backlist a try to see if I can find some underrated gems that she has written. Then I read a book called Arrival Stories, which is a collection of short stories where women share their experiences of becoming mothers. This was collected by Amy Schumer and Christy Turlington Burns. There are a lot of stories in here told by celebrities. Most of them are pretty typical stories of women becoming mothers, just like it says, but it does also have like an adoption story. It does have a stillbirth story. It has traumatic birth experience stories. It has at least one story told by a doula who does not have any children but supports women through becoming mothers. I see what this book was trying to do, and I do think there is value in women telling their stories just to raise awareness about how many different things can happen as you're becoming a mother, or how different becoming a mother can look like in every person and every family's situation. No two experiences are ever exactly the same, but at the same time, no one is ever going through something alone or that somebody else hasn't also experienced. So I get that community aspect. I do just think this book had some shortcomings in like the diversity of stories told. And it even mentions at the beginning here, like these are all women having children, but there are obviously stories of non-women having children or non-binary individuals having children or trans women having children. None of those were included in here, and that would have been nice to see some of those stories. And also, I believe all of these stories were set in the US, and again, many of these women are wealthy and celebrities, and so it's a very different experience for them receiving healthcare. It did talk a lot about minorities and discrimination that happens in healthcare and some struggles that came out of it, but I still feel like there was privilege here for the women that these stories are about that was maybe a little brushed over. So like I liked it, it was a good starting point, but I want more of this, if that makes sense. And maybe that's not a fair criticism of the book, like maybe more is coming, or maybe it's on me to seek out those additional stories. But I just felt a little bit unsatisfied at the end of this, and like I wanted something more or something different than exactly the experience I got out of reading this book. But I gave it 3 stars. Definitely worth reading because it's never bad reading about more people's experiences with something, but that's my take on that. And then the last book that I read this month is The Last House on the Street by Diane Chamberlain. This is a really interesting book that's kind of hard to describe. It's a historical fiction told in 2 timelines with 2 different main characters. The first is set several decades in the past, I want to say like 1950s-ish era. We're following this main character who has joined an organization. She's a white woman, and the organization is focused at getting Black citizens registered to vote. So very political. This main character is basically ostracized for joining this organization because she is surrounded by white people, Southern people, very comfortable in their positions as white Southern people who don't see the value in Black people being given the chance to vote. But our main character is very steadfast in her opinions that that is wrong and that obviously Black people should be given the opportunity to vote. So that's what she is doing back in like 1950s. And then we're following a main character in present day who lives in the same town, and she has just lost her husband, but she is moving into the house that she and her husband designed together. They're both architects. She's feeling weird about it. Obviously, she's still grieving the loss of her husband. And all of a sudden at work one day, she is confronted by this older woman who seems to know all about her past and is kind of threatening her not to move into that house. And so that's the second story. And basically those two timelines and those two women are intertwined. We just don't know why until more into the story. Honestly, if I knew that that's what this book was about before reading it, I probably wouldn't have been as interested in it, but it was really good. I really did like how the two stories came together. I was interested in both timelines. The past was really interesting because of what this woman was doing and fighting for, and then the present was really interesting because it was like this mystery of who is this woman and why is she threatening her, and they seem so unrelated, but it was really good. Diane Chamberlain is the author of The Dream Daughter, is probably her most popular book. I've also read that book. I loved it. And if you have also read that book and loved it, I would recommend this one. I feel like it's a similar vein of historical fiction with some very emotional elements. It definitely has that political undertone, so know that going in, but I think it makes for a really good and compelling story. And I ended up rating it 4 stars. So that is all the books that I read in November. It feels like I've been talking for a long time for only 13 books. Please let me know what you ended up reading last month and what some of your standout favorites from the month were. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I've been talking about and what your thoughts were. We can compare and discuss. And other than that, I don't think I have anything else. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you in my next one.